Isolation rarely begins with withdrawal. It begins with perception. When perception changes, relationships change without intention. Conversations feel familiar, but no longer activating. Social environments remain the same, yet their emotional impact weakens. Nothing dramatic occurs, but a subtle distance forms. This distance is often misinterpreted as disconnection. In reality, it reflects differentiation. Carl Jung described psychological strength not as resilience against life, but as a capacity to perceive reality without distortion. When that capacity develops, the individual stops unconsciously blending with collective attitudes. The psyche no longer dissolves itself into shared assumptions, emotional contagion, or group-based certainty. This shift is quiet. From the outside, the person appears unchanged. From the inside, the field of perception has widened. Contradictions become visible. Emotional undercurrents become noticeable. Repetitions stand out. What once felt natural begins to feel patterned. This is where isolation begins. Not because the individual rejects others, but because the psyche can no longer fully participate in unconscious agreement. Jung referred to this as a withdrawal from participation mystique. In everyday terms, it means no longer living inside borrowed emotions, inherited beliefs, or unexamined reactions. The cause of this withdrawal is subtle but consistent. Belonging becomes conditional. Conversations lose immediacy. Humor feels predictable. Moral certainty feels performative. Social bonding increasingly relies on shared narratives the psyche no longer fully believes. Nothing about this feels hostile. It feels distant. Psychological research on self-differentiation supports this observation. Individuals with high levels of introspective awareness and emotional regulation report fewer, but more selective social bonds. They are not less social. They are less reflexive. Reflexive bonding depends on mirroring. Differentiated bonding depends on resonance. Resonance is rare. This rarity is often experienced as isolation. Carl Jung never framed individuation as a socially rewarding process. He described it as a structural reorganization of the psyche that naturally alters one's relationship to the collective. The collective operates through consensus. The individuated psyche operates through coherence. Consensus creates belonging. Coherence creates distance. This distance is not superiority. It is incompatibility of operating systems. In daily life, this often emerges gradually. A person stops reacting automatically in conversations. They listen longer. They speak less. They no longer rush to fill silence or affirm shared outrage. They no longer perform agreement to maintain harmony. Others notice this shift before the individual does. You're quieter. You've changed. You seem distant. These observations are not accusations. They are signals of misalignment. The individual is no longer participating at the same emotional frequency. Carl Jung emphasized that the psyche reorganizes itself around internal authority as individuation progresses. External validation loses its regulating function. Approval no longer stabilizes identity. This internal shift removes the urgency to belong. Belonging was once necessary for psychological survival. Now it becomes optional. Optionality changes behavior. The individual no longer adapts automatically, no longer mirrors unconsciously, no longer absorbs collective emotion without reflection. This creates frictionless separation, isolation without conflict. From the outside, nothing appears broken. From the inside, something has detached. This detachment is often mislabeled as emotional coldness, but emotional coldness implies absence of feeling. What is actually present is containment. Contained emotion does not spill outward. It does not seek regulation through others. It remains internal. People often confuse containment with distance. They assume warmth requires expression. Carl Jung understood that emotional maturity often looks like neutrality to those who depend on emotional display for connection. This is where misunderstanding begins. The psychologically strong individual feels deeply, but expresses selectively. They no longer discharge emotion to create connection. They allow connection only when emotional truth is shared. This narrows the field. Fewer people qualify. This narrowing is not intentional. It is structural. In real life, this is observable in individuals who have undergone long periods of self-reflection, therapy, or internal crisis. After integration begins, they often report that old friendships feel misaligned without any specific reason. No betrayal occurred. No disagreement happened. No conflict needs resolution. Yet the connection no longer sustains itself. The psyche has outgrown unconscious bonding. Carl Jung described this as the ego no longer serving as a social adapter, but as a mediator between inner truth and outer reality. When the ego stops prioritizing adaptation, social ease decreases. Ease is replaced by accuracy. Accuracy is not always welcome. Most social systems rely on emotional shortcuts, shared assumptions, predictable reactions, mutual reinforcement of belief. Psychological depth disrupts these shortcuts. Depth introduces pauses, questions, ambiguity. These qualities destabilize group coherence. As a result, psychologically deep individuals are often perceived as distant even when they are present. Presence without participation feels unsettling to others. The person is there, but not fully merged. Carl Jung warned that individuation inevitably produces a period of alienation, not as punishment, but as consequence. The psyche cannot reorganize while maintaining full immersion in collective norms. Distance is required. This distance is often felt as loneliness, but it differs from social loneliness. Social loneliness is the absence of people. Existential loneliness is the absence of shared inner reality. The latter is far more common among psychologically aware individuals. They are surrounded, yet alone, not because they lack connection, because their inner orientation no longer matches a group. Modern studies on existential psychology support this distinction. Individuals with high meaning orientation and introspective depth often report feeling unseen even within relationships. They experience connection at the functional level, but not at the interpretive level. Their experience of reality has changed. They see patterns others ignore. They notice emotional defenses. They recognize projection. Once recognized, these phenomena cannot be unseen. This creates another layer of isolation. The individual becomes aware of how much of social interaction is driven by avoidance rather than truth. They hear what is not said. They sense what is defended. They notice when humor conceals discomfort. This awareness is not comforting. It removes illusion. Carl Jung believed that illusion is socially adhesive. It binds people together through shared distortion. Truth separates because it does not negotiate with comfort. Psychological strength increases tolerance for truth. But truth is isolating, not because it is harsh, because it is precise. Precision removes ambiguity. Ambiguity allows coexistence. This is why psychologically strong individuals often feel out of sync in group settings. The group operates on emotional approximation. The individual operates on internal coherence. Coherence does not bend easily. In daily life, this may show up as fatigue after social interaction, even when nothing stressful occurred. The fatigue is not from interaction itself, but from restraint. The individual restrains their perception. They withhold commentary. They choose not to correct distortions. This restraint consumes energy. It would be easier to disengage entirely. This is where isolation deepens, not through withdrawal, but through selective presence. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation does not remove the need for relationship, but it transforms its basis. Relationships formed through unconscious identification dissolve. Relationships formed through conscious recognition remain. But recognition is rare. This rarity creates gaps. Gaps feel like loneliness. Many individuals attempt to resolve this by returning to old modes of connection. They increase social activity. They re-engage with familiar groups. They attempt to recover a sense of belonging. This often fails. Not because others have changed, because the psyche has. The internal structure no longer supports the old bonding mechanism. This is not regression. It is irreversibility. One psychological differentiation occurs. Unconscious belonging cannot be restored. Carl Jung was explicit about this. Awareness cannot be undone. Consciousness does not contract voluntarily. The psyche moves forward or fractures. So the individual remains in a transitional state, no longer merged, not yet reconnected. This in-between state feels isolating, but it is not empty. It is formative. The psyche is recalibrating its relational orientation. It is learning to connect without self-erasure. This learning takes time. During this time, isolation functions as a stabilizer. It prevents regression. It protects coherence. It allows integration. Isolation is not the goal. It is a container. Within this container, the psyche consolidates its new structure. Old relational patterns fall away. New ones have not yet formed. This gap feels uncomfortable, but it is temporary. Carl Jung understood this phase as necessary tension. The psyche cannot skip it without distorting future relationships. Depth must settle before it can be shared. This is a realization that often brings relief. Isolation at this stage does not indicate deficiency. It indicates reorganization. The psyche is not rejecting connection. It is redefining it. And until that redefinition stabilizes, distance remains. Not as punishment, not as failure, as preparation. That understanding alone changes how isolation is experienced. It no longer needs to be escaped. It only needs to be recognized. Because isolation here is not absence of connection. It is the space required for a different kind of connection to become possible. You did not choose this distance deliberately. If you are honest, you may not have noticed it forming at all. It emerged gradually through small internal shifts that did not announce themselves. You still show up. You still respond. You still participate when required. But something in you no longer leans outward in the same way. Your attention does not stretch as far. Your emotional energy does not disperse as easily. Your reactions arrive later, if they arrive at all. This change often confuses you more than it confuses others. From the outside, people interpret distance as withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like consolidation. Carl Jung understood this state as a reorganization of inner authority. When the psyche no longer relies on external structures to orient itself, attention naturally turns inward, not toward self-absorption, but toward internal reference. You begin to notice that you no longer need immediate confirmation of your perceptions. Earlier in life, agreement stabilized you. Disagreement unsettled you. Recognition felt reassuring. Dismissal felt threatening. Now these reactions soften, not because you are detached, because your psyche is no longer regulated from the outside. This is where isolation quietly deepens. When your inner authority strengthens, external input loses urgency. You still register it, but it does not penetrate as deeply. Opinions pass through you instead of shaping you. This shift is subtle but consequential. You may notice that you no longer feel compelled to explain yourself. You stop preemptively clarifying your intentions. You allow misunderstanding to exist longer than before. This is not indifference. It is self-containment. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity requires the ego to relinquish its dependency on collective affirmation. When this happens, the individual stops negotiating their inner reality through others. Negotiation ends. Orientation begins. Orientation is quiet. It does not demand expression. It does not insist on agreement. It does not need defense. And because it does not seek reinforcement, it often appears invisible. Others sense this invisibility as distance. You may sense it as privacy. This is one of the most disorienting aspects of psychological strength. You feel more intact, yet less connected. Not because you desire separation, but because connection now requires a different foundation. Earlier, connection formed through shared emotion, shared outrage, shared enthusiasm, shared anxiety. Now, those entry points feel insufficient. You no longer bond through intensity. You no longer synchronize through reaction. Your psyche has outgrown reactive connection. Carl Jung described this as the ego stepping out of the emotional field of the collective. Once this happens, you no longer absorb the group's emotional tone unconsciously. You are present, but not fused. This creates a specific kind of isolation. You are still involved, but you are no longer merged. You may notice this most clearly in conversations. You listen, but you do not feel pulled to respond immediately. You hear emotional cues, but you do not automatically mirror them. You sense tension, but you do not rush to resolve it. Others may feel this as absence. You may feel it as steadiness. This steadiness is new. It replaces urgency with proportion. Proportion changes everything. What once felt important now feels contextual. What once demanded response now feels optional. What once unsettled you now registers without destabilizing you. This internal rebalancing often leaves you wondering whether something is missing. You may ask yourself why social interaction feels less rewarding, why praise no longer lifts you, why criticism no longer wounds you as deeply. These questions arise because emotional regulation has shifted location. Earlier, regulation happened externally. Now it happens internally. Carl Jung emphasized that when libido withdraws from outer objects, it does not disappear. It reorganizes. Energy previously spent maintaining social alignment is now invested in psychic coherence. Coherence feels quieter than alignment. It produces less stimulation. This is why isolation can feel dull. Not painful, dull. The psyche is no longer oscillating between approval and rejection. It is stabilizing around internal consistency. Stability is not exciting, but it is grounding. You may notice that you are less inclined to share personal experiences unless asked directly, not because you are guarded, but because narration no longer feels necessary. You live your experiences without translating them. This translation gap increases isolation. Others bond through storytelling. You no longer feel the need to narrate yourself. Carl Jung understood narration as an ego function that stabilizes identity through external reflection. When identity becomes internally anchored, narration loses urgency. You stop explaining your life to validate it. This is often misread as secrecy. In reality, it is sufficiency. Sufficiency changes social dynamics. People accustomed to reciprocal disclosure may feel you are withholding. People accustomed to emotional exchange may feel you are unavailable. You may feel neither withholding nor unavailable. You simply no longer externalize by default. This creates relational asymmetry. Others share, you receive, but you do not match intensity. Over time, this asymmetry increases distance. This is not intentional. It is structural. Your psyche is no longer organized around mutual emotional exchange. It is organized around internal equilibrium. Carl Jung would describe this as the self assuming a regulating role once held by the collective. When this happens, relationships must reorganize or dissolve. Some do, some do not. This process is rarely dramatic. It unfolds through fading. Less contact, less urgency, less emotional charge. This can feel like loss, but it is not loss in conventional sense. Nothing is taken from you. Something is released. You are released from the need to be continuously reflected. Reflection is replaced by recognition. Recognition does not require frequency. It requires accuracy. You may find that one conversation every few months feels more meaningful than daily interaction once did. This is not preference. It is compatibility. Your psyche now resonates with depth, not repetition. Carl Jung noted that as individuation progresses, quantity naturally gives way to quality. The psyche no longer distributes itself widely. It concentrates. Concentration reduces reach, but it increases precision. This precision can feel isolating when surrounded by diffuse social energy. You may find yourself observing more than participating, not because you are disengaged, because your psyche is no longer searching. Searching creates movement. Resolution creates stillness. This stillness can be misinterpreted as boredom, but boredom implies lack of interest. What you experience is selectivity. You are interested, but not in everything. Selectivity requires restraint. Restraint often looks like distance. Another subtle change occurs in how you experience disagreement. Earlier, disagreement triggered tension. You felt compelled to defend, persuade, or withdraw. Now, disagreement registers without escalation. You allow others to hold views that conflict with yours without internal agitation. This tolerance is not apathy. It is differentiation. Carl Jung believed that psychological strength allows conflicting realities to coexist without collapse. When you can hold contradiction internally, you no longer need external resolution. This reduces relational drama, but it also reduces bonding opportunities. Many relationships are sustained through shared opposition, shared enemies, shared outrage, shared defense. When you no longer participate in these dynamics, connection weakens. You may notice that certain people stop reaching out, not because you rejected them, because the emotional circuit no longer completes. This can feel lonely, but loneliness here does not mean you lack connection. It means connection has lost its previous structure. Your psyche is between relational forms. Old patterns no longer fit. New ones have not yet stabilized. This transitional isolation is not a mistake. Carl Jung emphasized that transformation requires a period of psychic solitude. Without it, new structures collapse under old demands. Solitude protects integration, even when it feels uncomfortable. You may notice that you no longer feel compelled to be understood immediately. Misunderstanding no longer feels threatening. This is one of the clearest signs that inner authority has reorganized. You trust your own coherence more than others' interpretations. Trust replaces defense. Defense once created engagement. Now, trust creates distance. This distance is not emptiness. It is boundary without rigidity. You are open but not porous. Porosity once allowed connection. Now it would dissolve coherence. The psyche chooses coherence. Isolation follows, not as rejection of others, as preservation of self. This realization often lands quietly. You stop asking why you feel distant. You stop searching for ways to reconnect artificially. You recognize that something is forming internally that requires space. This recognition does not eliminate loneliness, but it reframes it. Isolation is no longer a problem to solve. It becomes a condition to respect, because what is reorganizing in you cannot do so under constant relational demand. And once that reorganization completes, connection will return in a different form, not louder, not broader, truer. That understanding does not end the isolation, but it stabilizes it, and stability changes how you inhabit it. You are not missing something. You are becoming organized around something that cannot yet be shared. That is why distance exists now, not as absence, as preparation. You may have noticed that the isolation no longer feels as sharp as it once did. It still exists, but it no longer presses against you in the same way. The discomfort is softened. The urgency to explain it, resolve it, or escape it is weakened. This change does not come from improvement. It comes from accommodation. You have begun to live inside this distance without constantly reacting to it. Carl Jung understood this moment as a critical turning point. When the psyche stops interpreting isolation as a problem, it begins to use it as structure. Distance is no longer experienced as lack, but as orientation. Orientation stabilizes perception. Once perception stabilizes, your relationship to others changes again, not by returning to old forms of connection, but by removing the internal tension that made distance feel threatening. Earlier, isolation felt like something happening to you. Now, it feels like something happening within you. This distinction matters. When isolation is externalized, it produces anxiety. You look outward for causes. You evaluate relationships. You wonder what went wrong. When isolation is internalized, it becomes neutral. Neutrality changes how you move. You no longer scan social environments for signs of misalignment. You no longer monitor how you are perceived. You stop adjusting yourself in anticipation of others' expectations. This is not withdrawal. It is settling. Carl Jung believed that once individuation reaches a certain threshold, the psyche no longer needs to assert its difference. Difference becomes implicit. You do not need to demonstrate it. You simply live from it. Living from it removes friction. You may notice that you no longer feel the need to maintain distance deliberately. You are not protecting yourself. You are not guarding your energy. You are simply no longer leaking it. This is an important shift. Earlier, distance functioned as protection. It kept you from being pulled back into patterns that no longer fit. Now, protection is no longer required. The patterns no longer attract you. This internal change alters how connection reappears. Connection does not return through intensity. It does not return through shared activity. It does not return through effort. It returns through recognition. Recognition is quiet. You notice it when conversation does not require effort, when silence does not feel awkward, when difference does not require negotiation. These moments are rare, but they are unmistakable. Carl Jung described this as resonance between individuated psyches, not fusion, not agreement, but mutual acknowledgement of inner structure. These connections do not fill space. They occupy it efficiently. Because you are no longer seeking relief from isolation, you no longer pressure relationships to resolve it. Pressure once distorted connection. Now, absence of pressure allows it. This is why relationships that form after this phase feel fundamentally different. They do not distract you from yourself. They do not demand adaptation. They do not require performance. They coexist with your internal authority rather than competing with it. You may also notice a change in how you experience solitude. Earlier, solitude felt imposed. Now it feels chosen, even when it is not. This shift occurs because solitude is no longer interpreted as exclusion. It is interpreted as default. Carl Jung emphasized that the individuated psyche does not seek constant reflection. It requires periods of internal coherence to maintain stability. Solitude becomes functional, not as escape, as maintenance. You no longer ask whether you should be more social or less social. The question loses relevance. Relevance has shifted from quantity to alignment. Alignment determines engagement automatically. This removes internal debate. Without debate, energy conserves itself. You feel less drained by choice. This conservation of energy changes how you relate to life more broadly. Work feels different. Decisions feel cleaner. Time feels less pressured. This is not because life has slowed. It is because your internal pace is no longer dictated by external rhythms. Carl Jung believed that when inner authority stabilizes, time becomes objective rather than imposed. You move according to necessity, not expectation. This alters how urgency is experienced. Urgency now signals reality, not anxiety. When something truly requires action, you feel it clearly. When it does not, you remain unmoved. This discrimination was not possible earlier. Earlier, everything felt urgent because internal structure was still forming. Now, structure holds. Holding allows discernment. Discernment reduces noise. This reduction of noise is often mistaken for disengagement by others. They may perceive you as less available, less responsive, less invested. You may perceive yourself as more precise. Precision does not advertise itself. It simply operates. Carl Jung understood that once the psyche completes a major reorganization, it no longer announces its state. It functions from it. You do not explain your distance anymore. You do not justify your selectivity. You do not correct others' interpretations. Correction implies dependence. Dependence has ended. This does not mean you are closed. You remain open, but openness is no longer indiscriminate. You do not open to relieve discomfort. You open when resonance appears. This changes the emotional tone of your life. There is less intensity, less drama, less emotional volatility, but there is also less exhaustion. Exhaustion was the cost of constant adaptation. Adaptation is no longer required. Carl Jung believed that psychological energy wasted on adaptation becomes available for perception once adaptation ends. This is why life may feel simpler now, even if circumstances remain complex. Simplicity is not reduction of life. It is reduction of distortion. Distortion required constant correction. Correction required effort. Without distortion, effort decreases. This is why isolation no longer feels like something you must solve. It has completed its role. It helped you withdraw from external regulation. It gave space for internal authority to form. It protected integration from premature exposure. Now it recedes naturally, not by disappearing, by becoming irrelevant. You may still spend time alone. You may still feel different. You may still operate at a distance from collective urgency. But these no longer define your experience. They are simply conditions. Carl Jung described this as the ego stepping into service of self. When this happens, life no longer revolves around identity maintenance. Identity stabilizes internally and stops demanding reinforcement. This frees attention. You notice more, react less, move deliberately. Deliberation replaces compulsion. This is a quiet outcome of isolation. Not connection restored in its old form, but connection redefined. You no longer seek to belong. You allow belonging when it aligns. You no longer fear being alone. You recognize solitude as neutral. You no longer resist distance. You understand its purpose. This understanding settles something fundamental. The question shifts. Instead of asking why you feel separate, you begin to notice how little separation matters when inner coherence is present. Presence replaces proximity. You can be alone without feeling cut off. You can be with others without losing yourself. This balance was not possible earlier. It required the full passage through isolation. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation does not end in separation. It ends in differentiated participation. You return to life not as a fragment seeking completion, but as a whole capable of contact. Contact feels different from attachment. Attachment pulls. Contact meets. You are now capable of meeting without merging. This capability does not announce itself. It simply shows up in how little you struggle. The distance that once felt heavy now feels structural. It supports you. And because it supports you, it no longer demands attention. That is how you know this phase is ending. Not because connection suddenly appears everywhere, but because isolation no longer defines you. It has finished reorganizing your inner world. And now, whatever enters your life does so without needing to repair anything, only to meet what is already whole. What you have been living through does not require a solution. It requires recognition. The distance that formed was not a sign of failure, withdrawal, or emotional loss. It was a natural consequence of an internal shift that could not occur while you remain fully entangled with external regulation. Carl Jung understood that when the psyche reorganizes around its own center, separation appears before stability is felt. The separation was not the destination. It was a condition that allowed structure to form. Nothing essential was taken from you during this phase. What dissolved were dependencies that no longer fit. What remained was coherence. That coherence now changes how you experience both solitude and connection. You are no longer measuring your life by how involved you appear or how understood you feel. You are responding to life from a place that does not require constant confirmation. The quiet that surrounded you was not emptiness. The isolation was not absence. They were forms of containment. Containment allowed integration to complete without interference. It allowed inner authority to replace external pressure. It allowed perception to stabilize without distortion. Now, life does not need to feel full to feel intact. You can be alone without interpreting it as lack. You can connect without losing yourself. You can move without urgency and pause without anxiety. Nothing dramatic announces this state. It reveals itself through ease, through the absence of inner argument, through the way distance no longer feels personal. What you have gained is not detachment from others. It is attachment to what is internally true. That attachment does not isolate you. It anchors you. And from that anchor, whatever enters your life no longer needs to compensate, distract, or repair. It only needs to meet what is already stable. That is not a conclusion you arrive at. It is a condition you begin to live from.